It's 2025. You're scrolling through your phone, reading the news, planning your day, but something's wrong. Terribly wrong. The headline reads, "Slave auction brings record prices in Atlanta. Stock markets soar on plantation earnings. New tracking technology reduces escape attempts by 40%. This isn't some dystopian fiction. This isn't an alternate universe you can escape. In this timeline, this is your reality. This is America, right now, today. Because one moment in history went differently. One compromise, one political calculation, one failure of courage, and slavery never ended. 4 million people weren't freed in 1865. They remained in chains. Their children remained in chains. Their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, generation after generation, born into bondage, living in bondage, dying in bondage, for over 160 years, right here, right now. You think that's impossible? That progress is inevitable? That something so evil couldn't survive into the age of smartphones and social media? History has news for you. Nothing is inevitable. Every freedom you have was fought for. Every right you take for granted was paid for in blood, and it could all have been different. One signature, one vote, one battle. That's all it took. What if Lee had won at Gettysburg? What if Lincoln died 2 years earlier? What if the North simply got tired of fighting and decided that keeping the Union together mattered more than freeing 4 million people? The answer will horrify you. Because it almost happened. Because the forces pushing for compromise were powerful. Because racism existed in the North too. Because economic interests don't care about morality. And if it had happened, your world today would be unrecognizable. Worse than you can imagine. Darker than any nightmare. Welcome to the timeline where America never abolished slavery. Where the greatest democracy on earth became the greatest hypocrisy. Where technology advanced but humanity regressed. Where everything you know about freedom, justice, and human dignity simply never existed. This is that story. And it starts with a single moment when everything changed, or rather when everything stayed the same. To understand this nightmare scenario, we need to go back to a critical moment in American history. The year is 1865. The Civil War has been raging for 4 brutal years. Over 600,000 Americans have died in the conflict. Cities have been burned, economies have been shattered, families have been torn apart. The South is on the brink of collapse, its armies retreating, its infrastructure destroyed, its plantation economy in ruins. In our actual timeline, this is when the Confederacy surrenders unconditionally and slavery dies as a legal institution. But in our alternate timeline, something goes catastrophically different. Perhaps Abraham Lincoln's assassination happens earlier, not in April 1865 after the war's conclusion, but in early 1863, before the Emancipation Proclamation can take full effect and before his vision for Reconstruction can be articulated. Vice President Hannibal Hamlin assumes the presidency, but he lacks Lincoln's political genius and moral clarity. He's a decent man, but he's not Lincoln. Under pressure from moderate Republicans who are terrified of the war's cost and from Northern Democrats who never supported abolition in the first place, Hamlin pursues a negotiated settlement rather than total victory. Or perhaps the divergence point comes even earlier. Maybe at the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863, Lee's army achieves the breakthrough it historically failed to make. The Union lines collapse, Washington becomes threatened, and Northern morale crumbles. Or at Vicksburg that same month, perhaps Grant's siege fails, and the Mississippi remains under Confederate control, keeping the Confederacy viable as a split entity. These tactical victories don't lead to Southern independence. The Confederacy is still too weak for that, but they do create the conditions for a negotiated peace rather than unconditional surrender. There's another, perhaps more chilling possibility. Maybe the divergence isn't a matter of military outcomes or assassinations. Maybe it's simply that the political will to end slavery crumbles under the weight of economic pressure and racial prejudice that runs deeper than we'd like to admit. The war has been expensive, devastatingly so. Northern taxpayers are furious at the cost. Northern families are burying their sons by the thousands. And for what? To free people that many Northerners view as inferior and don't want as neighbors or competitors for jobs. The racism of the North, while different in character from Southern slavery, is real and pervasive. In this scenario, as the war drags into 1864 and 1865, a coalition of Northern Democrats and moderate Republicans begins pushing for a compromise peace. They're joined by Northern business interests who are desperate to restore trade with the South and resume the flow of cotton to Northern mills. They're supported by Northern workers who fear that millions of freed slaves will migrate north and compete for jobs, driving down wages. The abolitionist faction, while vocal and passionate, represents a smaller portion of Northern public opinion than we might like to believe. Let's say that in this timeline, the Civil War ends not with the South's unconditional surrender at Appomattox, but with a compromise negotiated in late 1864 or early 1865. War-weary Northern politicians, facing tremendous casualties, economics, strain, and public pressure to end the conflict, agree to a peace treaty that preserves the Union technically, but allows Southern states to maintain their peculiar institution under a framework of state rights. The agreement is sold to the public as a restoration of the Union with the promise of gradual, compensated emancipation at some undefined future date. But everyone involved knows this is a polite fiction. The 13th Amendment never passes. Instead, a different amendment is ratified, one that explicitly protects the institution of slavery where it already exists while theoretically preventing its expansion into new territories. It's carefully worded to seem like a compromise, using euphemistic language about state sovereignty and property rights, but its effect is clear. Slavery is permanently embedded into the American constitutional order. Congress cannot abolish it. Presidents cannot emancipate the enslaved. It can only end if individual states choose to end it, and Southern states have no intention of doing so. This devil's bargain is justified by its architects with the argument that preserving the Union is the paramount goal, that the country cannot survive being permanently divided, and that slavery will wither away naturally as it becomes economically unviable in an industrializing world. This last argument is particularly insidious because it appeals to those who want to believe that moral problems can be solved by economic forces without anyone having to make difficult choices or sacrifices. It allows Northerners to feel good about their pragmatism while washing their hands of the enslaved people's suffering. The consequences of this compromise begin immediately and echo through the centuries. Southern states, having secured constitutional protection for slavery, move quickly to restore and reinforce the institution. The chaos of the war years, during which many enslaved people escaped or lived in quasi-free conditions in Union-occupied territories, is reversed. Massive manhunts are organized to recapture those who escaped. Federal troops, still stationed in the South as part of the peace agreement, are ordered to assist in these recaptures. The betrayal is complete and devastating for the 4 million people who had been enslaved, who had seen glimmers of hope during the war years. This reversal is a trauma almost beyond comprehension. Families that had been reunited are separated again. People who had tasted freedom are forced back into bondage. The psychological toll is immense. Many resist, choosing death over re-enslavement. Suicide rates spike. Others flee north or west, braving incredible dangers to escape. But most are caught and returned, facing brutal punishments designed to break their spirits and serve as warnings to others who might try to resist. The immediate aftermath of this compromise is chaos, violence, and a level of human suffering that is difficult to fully articulate. Abolitionists in the North are outraged, feeling betrayed by their own government. Frederick Douglass, who in our timeline lived to see slavery's end and became a powerful voice in Reconstruction, instead spends his remaining years in bitter fury at the compromise. His speeches become even more militant, calling not just for political action, but for armed resistance. Harriet Tubman, the woman who led hundreds to freedom on the Underground Railroad, refuses to accept this betrayal. She continues her work. But now it's not about leading people to freedom in the North. It's about organizing armed resistance in the South itself. Other abolitionist leaders respond in different ways. Some, exhausted by years of struggle and now facing constitutional protections for slavery, fall into despair and retreat from public life. Others radicalize further, forming clandestine organizations dedicated to the violent overthrow of the slaveholding regime. These organizations operate like revolutionary cells, conducting sabotage, freeing enslaved people by force, and sometimes assassinating particularly brutal slaveholders. The federal government, bound by the constitutional compromise, finds itself in the position of suppressing what it acknowledges are freedom fighters, but which it must legally treat as terrorists and criminals. Underground resistance movements spring up across the South, but without the force of federal law behind emancipation, they're fighting an uphill battle against state governments now emboldened by constitutional protection and federal acquiescence. These movements are brutally suppressed. Southern states, traumatized by the war and paranoid about slave rebellions, transform into police states. The old slave patrol systems are not disbanded, but expanded and professionalized. What emerges is essentially a standing army of white men whose full-time job is controlling the enslaved population. Slave rebellions that were brutally suppressed in our timeline's antebellum period erupt with even greater frequency and desperation in this post-war era. The formerly enslaved population has seen Union armies, has heard promises of freedom, has experienced hope, and the crushing of that hope generates a rage that cannot be contained. In Virginia, in Alabama, in Mississippi, in Louisiana, rebellions explode across the South in the years following the compromise. These are not small-scale escapes, but organized uprisings involving hundreds or thousands of people simultaneously. The most significant of these rebellions occurs in South Carolina in 1867, where formerly enslaved people who had been living in quasi-freedom during Union occupation rise up when confronted with re-enslavement. They seize weapons from armories, take control of several plantations, and establish what they call a free zone around Beaufort. For 3 weeks, they hold this territory against state militia forces, establishing their own government and sending appeals to the federal government and to foreign nations for recognition and support. The appeals are ignored or rejected. Eventually, federal troops are sent in to crush the rebellion. The violence is extreme, the death toll immense. The leaders are executed publicly as a warning. It's a massacre, and it sends a message that resistance is futile. But resistance continues anyway, taking different forms. In some areas, enslaved people engage in work slowdowns and sabotage, destroying crops and equipment, making slavery as economically painful as possible for their owners. In other areas, they create underground networks of communication and mutual aid, maintaining culture and community in the face of attempts to dehumanize them. Religious services, held in secret in woods and swamps, become centers of resistance, places where people can affirm their humanity and plan for freedom. The spirituals that emerged from slavery in our timeline take on new verses in this darker timeline, verses that speak not just of otherworldly salvation, but of earthly liberation by any means necessary. The South becomes a militarized police state, with slave patrols evolving into something resembling a permanent occupying army over its own people. These patrols are equipped not just with the weapons of the war era, but with new technologies designed specifically for control. Telegraph systems allow rapid communication between patrols, making coordinated manhunts more effective. Photography is used to create databases of enslaved people, making it harder to escape by claiming to be free. The technology that could liberate is weaponized for oppression from the very beginning. But here's where our timeline takes a turn that most people wouldn't expect. The North doesn't simply wash its hands of slavery and move on. Economic interests are too deeply intertwined. Northern textile mills in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Pennsylvania depend completely on Southern cotton. Northern banks, particularly in New York, hold massive investments in Southern plantations, loans that are only viable if slavery continues. Northern insurance companies insure human property and profit from slavery's continuation. Northern shipping. Companies transport the products of slave labor to global markets. Northern manufacturers sell tools, clothing, and equipment to Southern plantations. A gradual, insidious process begins where Northern states, while maintaining their nominal free status and congratulating themselves on their moral superiority, become increasingly complicit in the perpetuation of slavery. It's not that slavery expands northward legally, but that Northern economic and political systems become so dependent on its continuation that they actively work to sustain it. Northern banks refuse to loan money to businesses that won't trade with slaveholding states. Northern newspapers, dependent on advertising from companies involved in the slave economy, downplay or ignore the brutality of slavery. Northern politicians, receiving campaign contributions from businesses built on slavery, oppose any federal interference with the institution. This creates a bizarre cognitive dissonance in Northern society. Northerners tell themselves they're against slavery in principle, but they oppose any practical action to end it. They claim to sympathize with the enslaved, but won't risk their economic well-being to help them. They pride themselves on being more enlightened than Southerners, while profiting from the same system of human bondage. This hypocrisy is perhaps more morally corrosive than the South's open embrace of slavery, because it involves a constant self-deception and rationalization. Northern workers, who might naturally ally with enslaved people as fellow laborers being exploited by capital, instead often become some of the most fervent supporters of slavery's continuation. They've been convinced by racist propaganda that their interests are opposed to those of enslaved people, that abolition would lead to millions of black workers flooding north and competing for jobs. Labor unions, which should be fighting for the rights of all workers, instead sometimes explicitly exclude black people and support the maintenance of slavery as a way of keeping black labor confined to the South. It's a tragedy of false consciousness, workers aligning with their oppressors against other workers. The federal government, constrained by the constitutional compromise, becomes paralyzed on the issue of slavery. Presidents, whether they personally oppose slavery or not, find their hands tied. Congress is split between a Southern bloc that militantly defends slavery and Northern legislators who range from cautious moderates to frustrated abolitionists who lack the votes to do anything meaningful. The Supreme Court, which in our timeline eventually became a force for expanding civil rights, instead becomes a defender of slavery, issuing ruling after ruling that reinforces the constitutional protection of human bondage and limits any federal power that might threaten it. This paralysis extends to foreign policy as well. America's diplomatic position in the world becomes increasingly awkward and untenable. Britain and France, which abolished slavery decades earlier, are both attracted to American markets and repelled by American slavery. They condemn slavery publicly in the strongest terms, but continue to trade privately, creating a situation where their moral denunciations are revealed as hollow. British textile manufacturers depend on American cotton just as much as Northern mills do. French wines, silks, and luxury goods find eager markets among wealthy Southern plantation owners. The economic incentives for continued trade overwhelm the moral imperative to isolate and pressure the slave regime. As we move into the 1870s and 1880s, we see something truly disturbing emerge, something that would have been impossible in the antebellum period. Technology and slavery begin to merge in ways that create a new, more efficient, more profitable, and somehow even more dehumanizing form of human bondage. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing across the Western world, bringing unprecedented technological change. In free societies, this technology liberates workers from backbreaking labor and creates new opportunities. In slave societies, it becomes a tool of oppression. Southern plantation owners, now secure in the constitutional protection of their property rights, begin to mechanize their operations. But they're not mechanizing to replace slave labor. They're mechanizing to make slave labor more productive and more controllable. Steam-powered cotton gins operated by enslaved workers allow for processing cotton at scales unimaginable in the antebellum era. A single plantation can now produce 5 or 10 times as much cotton with the same number of enslaved workers. The productivity gains make slavery even more profitable than it was before the war. Railway systems built entirely by unfree labor crisscross the South, connecting plantations to ports and markets with unprecedented efficiency. These railways are monuments to human suffering. Thousands of enslaved people die building them, work to death in conditions that rival the worst abuses of the antebellum period. The railways serve dual purposes: moving goods to market and moving human chattel. Special cars are designed for transporting enslaved people, essentially mobile prisons that can move hundreds of people at once. The domestic slave trade, which had been disrupting families for decades before the Civil War, becomes industrialized and more brutal. Telegraph systems proliferate across the South, but their primary purpose is control. When an enslaved person escapes, their description and last known location can be telegraphed to law enforcement and slave catchers across multiple states within hours. What used to take days or weeks of searching on horseback can now be coordinated almost instantaneously. The technology that in free societies enables commerce and communication becomes, in slave societies, a tool of surveillance and recapture. Escape, which was always difficult, becomes nearly impossible. Photography serves a similar purpose. Every enslaved person is photographed, creating a visual database that can be distributed to law. Southern economists develop elaborate theories arguing that slavery is not only morally justified, but economically optimal. They publish papers and books arguing that the paternalistic care provided by masters is superior to the wage slavery of northern factories, where workers can be fired and left to starve. They argue that slavery provides stability, continuity, and social order that chaotic free labor systems cannot match. They point to poverty, crime, and labor unrest in northern cities as evidence that free labor is actually inferior. It's a lie built on stolen lives and unpaid labor. But it's a lie that enough people find convenient to believe, especially those profiting from the system. International economic relationships reinforce these developments. The Industrial Revolution in Britain and Europe creates insatiable demand for American cotton, which remains the primary feedstock for textile mills from Manchester to Milan. The price of cotton remains high, making southern plantations extraordinarily profitable. This wealth allows plantation owners to invest in more land, more enslaved workers, and more advanced technology, creating a vicious cycle where the success of slavery enables its expansion and intensification. Northern industries that produce the machinery, tools, and equipment used in southern plantations profit enormously from this trade. Manufacturers in Pennsylvania produce the steam engines that power plantation operations. Tool makers in Connecticut supply the specialized equipment used in cotton processing. These northern companies have zero incentive to see slavery end. Quite the opposite, they lobby aggressively for policies that protect and expand slavery because their profits depend on it. The economic integration of North and South around the slavery system becomes so complete that it's difficult to identify where free labor, capitalism ends, and slave labor, capitalism begins. International relations become incredibly complex and morally compromised during this period. Britain and France, which abolished slavery in their colonies in the 1830s and pride themselves on being enlightened, progressive nations, find themselves in an impossible position. They are both attracted to American markets, deeply dependent on American cotton and other slave-produced goods, and genuinely repelled by American slavery. The result is a foreign policy built on hypocrisy and self-deception that corrupts their own societies even as they claim moral superiority. British politicians give passionate speeches in Ideochiu, Parliament condemning slavery, calling it an abomination against God and man. The British press publishes exposés of the brutality of American slavery, complete with engravings of whippings, brandings, and families being torn apart at auction. British churches organize prayer meetings for the enslaved. But at the same time, British merchant ships are loading American cotton by the ton. British banks are financing American plantations. British consumers are buying products made from slave labor and enjoying them without a second thought. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. Some British abolitionists, genuinely committed to ending slavery globally, call for economic sanctions and diplomatic isolation of America. They organize boycotts of American goods and pressure Parliament to cut trade ties. But they're fighting against powerful economic interests. The textile industry employs millions of British workers, and those workers are demanding the cheap American cotton that keeps them employed. When abolitionists suggest that Britain should sacrifice economic prosperity for moral principle, they're met with fierce resistance from workers who don't want to lose their jobs and industrialists who don't want to lose their profits. France faces similar contradictions. The French Revolution proclaimed liberty, equality, and fraternity, ideals completely incompatible with slavery. France abolished slavery in its colonies in 1848, just 17 years before our divergence point. French intellectuals write eloquent treatises on human dignity and natural rights. But French luxury goods manufacturers are some of the biggest customers of wealthy southern plantation owners. French wines, perfumes, and fashions are status symbols in the South, purchased with wealth extracted from enslaved labor. The contradiction between French ideals and French economic practice creates a cynicism that infects French political culture. This hypocrisy creates a new international order where economic interests trump human rights on a global scale, establishing precedents that poison international relations for generations. The idea that trade and economic ties should be maintained regardless of a nation's internal practices, that business and morality should be kept separate, becomes normalized in ways that enable all sorts of atrocities beyond just slavery. It establishes a pattern where the international community will express moral outrage while doing nothing, substantive to stop injustice, if stopping it would be economically costly. Other European nations follow similar patterns. German states, in the process of unification during this period, see American slavery as none of their business and focus on establishing trade relationships. The Spanish Empire, still clinging to its colonies in Cuba and the Philippines where slavery continues, sees America as a potential ally in defending the institution against abolitionist pressure. Portugal, with its own history of slavery, maintains friendly relations with the American South. The Netherlands, despite having abolished slavery, profits from financing and ensuring American trade. The international community becomes a web of complicity. Some European intellectuals even begin to argue for a return to unfree labor systems in their own countries. They look at America's economic growth in this timeline and argue that slavery, or something like it, might be necessary for industrial development. They claim that forcing primitive peoples to work is actually beneficial, that it civilizes them and teaches them habits of industry. These arguments resurrect ideas that seem discredited after abolition in our timeline. The moral progress of the 19th century begins to reverse, not just in America but globally. The impact extends beyond Europe. The Ottoman Empire, grappling with questions of modernization and reform, looks at America's economic success and decides that abolishing slavery, which was already happening gradually in Ottoman territories, was perhaps premature. The institution is given new life, justified by pointing to America as proof that slavery is compatible with modernity. In East Asia, where various forms of bonded labor had existed, the American example prevents reforms that might have happened otherwise. Slavery's persistence in America gives cover to oppressive labor systems worldwide. Latin American nations, many of which achieved independence with ideals of liberty and equality, find themselves in difficult positions. Some, like Brazil, which maintained slavery longer than other Latin American countries, use America as justification for their own institutions. Others, which abolished slavery, feel pressure from their own economic elites who point to America's prosperity and suggest that abolition was a mistake. The entire Western Hemisphere becomes divided between slave and free societies in ways that create lasting tensions and prevent the development of the kind of inter-American cooperation that emerged in our timeline. The international slave trade, which had been suppressed by British and American naval patrols in our timeline, experiences a resurgence. With slavery constitutionally protected in America and demand for enslaved labor growing with industrial expansion, smuggling operations bring new captives from Africa and the Caribbean. The British Navy continues to intercept slave ships when it can, but American vessels fly the American flag and cannot be searched without creating international incidents. The trade operates in the shadows, but it operates, bringing new horrors to hundreds of thousands of Africans who thought the international slave trade had ended. International law develops in corrupted ways during this period. The concepts of sovereignty and non-interference, which could be positive principles allowing nations to develop independently, instead become shields behind which atrocities can be committed without consequence. When human rights advocates call for international pressure on America to end slavery, they're told that internal institutions are domestic matters beyond international jurisdiction. This principle will be used repeatedly in the future to excuse genocides, ethnic cleansing, and totalitarian oppression. The failure to confront American slavery establishes catastrophic precedents. Diplomatic relations between America and the rest of the world take on surreal qualities. Foreign ambassadors posted to Washington attend glittering social events where enslaved people serve food and drink. They smile and make polite conversation with slaveholders whose wealth is built on human bondage. They write reports back to their home countries describing the contradiction between American rhetoric about liberty and American practice of slavery. But their governments instruct them to maintain friendly relations because trade is too important. The normalization of this evil in diplomatic circles represents a profound moral failure of the international community. Some missionaries and humanitarian organizations try to work within this system to ameliorate the worst abuses of slavery. They established schools for enslaved children, medical clinics on plantations, and advocacy programs claiming to promote better treatment. But their work, while motivated by genuine compassion, ultimately serves to legitimize slavery by making it seem more humane and therefore more acceptable. As we enter the 20th century, the world looks radically different from our own. The industrial revolutions that transformed economies, the social movements that challenged old hierarchies, the scientific discoveries that expanded human knowledge, all of these have happened, but they've happened in the shadow of American slavery's continued existence. This casts a pall over what should have been a century of progress and promise. Instead, the 20th century in this timeline begins with the world's most powerful democracy being fundamentally undemocratic, claiming to stand for freedom while denying it to millions. The First World War still happens, triggered by the same nationalist tensions, imperial competitions, and alliance systems that led to war in our timeline. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June 1914 still sets off a chain reaction of mobilizations and declarations of war. But America's role in this conflict is fundamentally altered by the continued existence of slavery, creating a very different trajectory for the war and its aftermath. In our timeline, America entered the war in April 1917, and American involvement was justified with soaring rhetoric about making the world safe for democracy, about fighting for the rights of small nations, about defending freedom against tyranny. President Woodrow Wilson's speeches framed the war in moral terms that resonated with American ideals and helped mobilize public support. But can you imagine such rhetoric coming from a nation built partially on slave labor? The contradiction is too glaring, too obvious, too impossible to ignore or explain away. American politicians in this timeline who advocate for entering the war face devastating counterarguments. How can America fight for democracy in Europe while denying basic rights to millions at home? How can America condemn German militarism while maintaining slave patrols that terrorize its own population? How can America claim moral authority to reshape the world order when its own house is built on the foundation of human bondage? These questions don't have good answers, and they make American entry into the war far more difficult politically. Moreover, the practical questions of mobilization are complicated by slavery. In our timeline, Black Americans served in World War I, over 350,000 of them, hoping that their service would earn them greater rights and respect at home. But in a timeline where millions are still enslaved, military service becomes fraught with impossible contradictions. Do enslaved people serve in the military? If they do, are they freed upon enlistment? If they're freed to serve, doesn't that undermine the entire justification for slavery? If they're not freed, can you really arm enslaved people and send them to fight, trusting that they won't turn those weapons on their oppressors? The debate over these questions paralyzes American politics for years. Some argue that the war is none of America's business, that the European powers created their own mess and should sort it out themselves. Isolationism, already a powerful force in American politics, becomes dominant. Others argue that America should enter the war on the side of the Central Powers, that Germany and Austria-Hungary represent traditional order and hierarchy compatible with American slavery, while Britain and France represent dangerous liberal ideals about universal human rights. This argument doesn't prevail, but the fact that it's even seriously debated shows how corrupted American political discourse has become. Perhaps America enters the war much later than in our timeline, only in 1918 or not at all. Let's explore the scenario where America remains neutral throughout the war. Without American intervention, without American troops arriving to reinforce exhausted Allied armies, without American loans keeping Britain and France afloat financially, the war's outcome is very different. Perhaps it ends in 1918 as in our timeline, but with a negotiated settlement rather than German defeat. Perhaps Germany achieves the breakthrough on the Western Front that it always sought, taking Paris and forcing Allied surrender. Or perhaps the war simply grinds on into 1919, 1920, even longer, with millions more casualties and European civilization grinding itself into dust. Any of these outcomes radically changes the trajectory of the 20th century. If the war ends in negotiated settlement or German victory, there's no Versailles Treaty with its harsh terms that destabilize Germany and help bring Hitler to power. But there's also no League of Nations, no attempt at international cooperation to prevent future wars, no spread of democratic ideals that happened after Allied victory. Europe emerges from the war exhausted and cynical, with traditional empires perhaps still intact or replaced by new authoritarian systems. The map of Europe looks completely different. If America does eventually enter the war, perhaps in a limited way, American forces are segregated in ways that make our timeline segregation look mild. Enslaved people might be used as laborers, digging trenches and moving supplies, but never as combat soldiers. Free Black Americans who volunteer face discrimination so severe that it prevents them from serving effectively. The military experience that created a generation of civil rights leaders in our timeline either doesn't happen or happens in such compromised circumstances that its political impact is minimal. The wartime propaganda that emerges from a slaveholding America is bizarre and disturbing. Posters calling for Americans to fight for freedom while slavery exists at home create cognitive dissonance that artists and propagandists struggle to resolve. Some propaganda simply ignores slavery entirely, pretending it doesn't exist. Other propaganda tries to argue that slavery is actually a form of freedom, using Orwellian doublespeak that would be comical if it wasn't so evil. The moral confusion of the messaging undermines the war effort and contributes to America's limited role in the conflict. After the war, whatever its outcome, the idealistic calls for self-determination and democracy that followed World War I in our timeline ring even more hollow, coming from a nation that still enslaves millions. Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, if they're articulated at all in this timeline, are met with derision and mockery internationally. How can America advocate for the self-determination of peoples in Europe while denying it to people in its own South? The hypocrisy is too blatant for anyone to take seriously. The League of Nations, if it forms at all, is paralyzed by this fundamental contradiction from its inception. America either doesn't join because isolationists point to the hypocrisy of joining an organization dedicated to principles America doesn't practice, or America does join and the organization is immediately discredited by having a slaveholding nation as a member. Either way, the League is even more ineffective than it was in our timeline. Unable to prevent the conflicts and crises of the 1920s and 1930s that lead to World War II, American moral authority on the world stage, which was growing before the war and expanded significantly during and after it in our timeline, is non-existent here. When America speaks about democracy, freedom, or human rights, the international response is laughter or contempt. This creates a power vacuum in international affairs that other nations rush to fill. Perhaps Britain and France maintain their dominance longer, despite being weakened by the war. Perhaps new powers emerge to challenge them. But America is not the arsenal of democracy or the beacon of freedom that it became in our timeline. It's a cautionary tale, an example of a nation that betrayed its own ideals. The 1920s and 1930s present their own unique horrors, multiplying the tragedies that occurred in our timeline. The Roaring Twenties, which in our world was a period of economic boom, cultural flowering, and social change, is fundamentally different when slavery still exists. The Jazz Age, the Harlem Renaissance, the flowering of Black culture and artistic achievement that defined the 1920s in our timeline, either doesn't happen or happens in severely constrained circumstances. The artists, musicians, and writers who should be creating and innovating are mostly still enslaved, their talents stolen and suppressed. Some cultural production by Black Americans still happens in the North, particularly in cities like New York, Chicago, and Detroit, where free Black communities exist. But these communities live under the shadow of slavery's continued existence in the South. Every achievement is bittersweet, celebrated with the knowledge that millions of their brothers and sisters remain in chains. The art that emerges is perhaps even more powerful and angry than in our timeline, but it reaches smaller audiences and faces more severe censorship from a society uncomfortable with its revolutionary messages. The economic boom of the 1920s in this timeline is built even more heavily on exploitation and inequality than in our world. The stock market speculation, the consumer credit boom, the sense that prosperity will continue forever. All of this happens, but with the added moral rot of slavery underneath it all. Northern investors are making fortunes speculating on Southern plantations. New financial instruments allow people to invest in human property without ever seeing the enslaved people themselves. The commodification and financialization of human beings reaches new heights. Then comes October 1929, and the House of Cards collapses. The stock market crash happens for similar reasons as in our timeline. speculation, overproduction, income inequality, and financial system instability. But the presence of slavery adds additional dimensions to the crisis. When the market crashes, the value of enslaved people as financial assets. The Great Depression hits, and it hits a nation whose economy is still partially dependent on unpaid labor. This creates perverse situations that seem designed to maximize human suffering. In the North, unemployment skyrockets as it did in our timeline, with millions of workers losing their jobs and facing destitution. In the South, enslaved people cannot be unemployed in the traditional sense, but their conditions deteriorate catastrophically as plantation owners, facing their own economic ruin, cut already minimal provisions to the bone. Enslaved people face starvation on a scale not seen since the worst days of the antebellum period. Malnutrition becomes universal. Diseases that could be prevented or treated with minimal medical care instead kill thousands. The death rate among enslaved populations spikes dramatically. Some plantation owners, unable to feed the people they own and unable to sell them because there's no market, simply abandon plantations and let the enslaved people fend for themselves. This creates groups of people who are legally still enslaved but practically freed by economic catastrophe, wandering the countryside in search of food and shelter. But here's where the racism and scapegoating reach truly horrifying levels. In the North, where free black workers are competing with white workers for scarce jobs, racial tensions explode into violence. Race riots erupt in cities across the North and West. Black workers are blamed for taking jobs from white workers, even though both groups are victims of the same economic system. Lynchings, already common in the South, spread to northern cities. The violence is often encouraged, or at least tolerated by local authorities, who find racial conflict convenient for distracting from economic inequality. In the South, enslaved people are somehow blamed for the economic crisis despite having no economic power or agency whatsoever. Propaganda blames them for being lazy, for not working hard enough, for being an economic burden in hard times. The absurdity of blaming people for an economic crisis when they're not even paid for their labor and have no participation in the economic system doesn't prevent the propaganda from being effective. Hatred and violence against enslaved people intensifies as white Southerners look for scapegoats for their own suffering. The federal government's response to the Depression, the New Deal programs that lifted millions out of poverty in our timeline, is either non-existent or profoundly compromised in this one. Franklin Roosevelt, if he's elected president in 1932, faces an impossible political situation. Any federal program designed to provide relief and employment has to grapple with the existence of slavery. If the federal government pays wages to workers on public projects, what about enslaved people? Are they paid? If they're paid, doesn't that undermine slavery? If they're not paid, are they forced to work on federal projects, making the federal government complicit in slavery? Southern Democrats in Congress who represent slaveholding states block or water down any New Deal legislation that might threaten slavery or provide relief to enslaved people. They insist that any federal programs respect state sovereignty over slavery and not interfere with the institution. This means that the most ambitious programs for social welfare and economic recovery are either never implemented or implemented in ways that explicitly exclude enslaved people and often free black Americans as well. The New Deal, such as it exists, is for white Americans only. This creates a two-tier system of government support that makes the racial inequalities of our timeline's New Deal, which were severe, look mild by comparison. Social Security, if it's created, explicitly excludes agricultural and domestic workers, which means it excludes most enslaved people and many free black workers. Public works programs hire white workers first and often exclusively. Housing programs segregate by race and explicitly refuse to insure mortgages in black neighborhoods, creating the redlining that will poison American cities for generations. The Depression years also see the rise of radical political movements on both left and right that react to the economic crisis and the slavery question. Communist and socialist movements in America explicitly call for the abolition of slavery and link it to broader critiques of capitalism. They organize among both white and black workers, trying to build solidarity across racial lines. This makes them targets of intense government repression. Organizers are arrested, beaten, or killed. Unions that admit black members or call for Abolition are destroyed by employer violence with government support or acquiescence. On the right, fascist and white supremacist movements emerge that explicitly celebrate slavery as an ideal system and call for its expansion or intensification. They look at the rise of fascism in Europe, particularly Nazi Germany, and see kindred spirits in racial ideology. These movements attract followers among white workers who are suffering economically, but are convinced that their interests lie in racial solidarity with slaveholders rather than class solidarity with black workers. The potential for interracial, working-class movements that could challenge both slavery and capitalism is undermined by this racist appeal. Meanwhile, resistance movements among enslaved people continue and adapt to depression conditions. The economic chaos creates opportunities for escape and resistance that didn't exist before. With plantations abandoned or barely supervised due to owners' financial troubles, enslaved people organized their own communities in isolated areas, creating maroon settlements in swamps, forests, and mountains. These settlements, inspired by historical maroon communities in the Caribbean and South America, become centers of resistance culture and bases for raids to free others. The Depression also forces many Americans to confront the moral bankruptcy of their system in ways that might have been avoided during prosperity. When the economy was booming, it was easy to claim that slavery was justified by economic success. When the economy collapses, that justification disappears. Some white Americans, facing their own poverty and desperation, begin to question why slavery should continue if it's not even bringing prosperity. This doesn't automatically translate into abolition support. Human selfishness and racism are powerful forces, but it does create openings for abolitionist arguments that didn't exist before. Churches and religious organizations grapple with the Depression in this context as well. The social gospel movement, which in our timeline called for Christianity to address social problems and economic justice, faces the slavery question head-on. Some churches radicalize, calling slavery a sin that must be abolished regardless of economic cost. Others retreat into quietism or actively defend slavery as divinely ordained. The splits within American Christianity that exist in our timeline become chasms in this one, with denominations dividing over slavery just as they did before the Civil War, except now the divisions are even deeper and more bitter. Meanwhile, resistance movements have been evolving. By the 1930s, there are organized networks of freedom fighters operating across the South. These aren't just escape routes, but actual armed resistance groups, carrying out sabotage, freeing enslaved people, and sometimes engaging in open warfare with state militias. The South is a region in a perpetual state of low-intensity conflict. The federal government, still bound by the compromise that preserved slavery, finds itself in the impossible position of sometimes having to send federal troops to suppress these uprisings to maintain constitutional order. Then comes the Second World War, and this is where our alternate timeline reaches perhaps its most disturbing and morally catastrophic crossroads. Nazi Germany rises in the 1930s with its ideology of racial superiority, its plans for enslaving so-called inferior races, its explicit goal of creating a racial hierarchy across Europe. In our timeline, America fought against this evil, joining the Allies and playing a crucial role in defeating Hitler and liberating concentration camps. The war was framed as a struggle between freedom and tyranny, democracy and fascism, good and evil. But in a timeline where America itself practices race-based slavery, where millions of human beings are held in bondage based solely on their race, where racial hierarchy is embedded in the Constitution and defended as natural and proper, everything changes in ways that are truly horrifying to contemplate. The ideological similarities between Nazi racial theories and American slavery are too obvious to ignore. Nazi theorists explicitly looked to American history for inspiration, studying how America dealt with its indigenous population and maintained racial hierarchy. In our timeline, this was historical reference. In this alternate timeline, it's contemporary reality. Nazi Germany and slaveholding America share core beliefs: that races exist as biological realities with inherent differences in ability and worth, that superior races have the right to dominate inferior races, that maintaining racial purity is essential, and that using force to maintain racial hierarchy is justified. This creates an absolutely catastrophic situation where the world's most powerful democracy and the world's most dangerous fascist regime have fundamental ideological common ground. Does America even oppose Nazi Germany in this timeline? The question itself is almost unbearable, but we have to confront it. Some American politicians and intellectuals might actually express admiration for Hitler's efficiency in organizing unfree labor, for his solutions to racial questions, for his willingness to act on beliefs that. The most likely scenario is that America remains neutral far longer than in our timeline, perhaps for the entire conflict. When Germany invades Poland in September 1939, triggering declarations of war from Britain and France, America stays out. President Roosevelt, if he's in office, may personally oppose Nazi Germany, but faces overwhelming isolationist sentiment reinforced by the slavery question. How can America fight against Nazi racial tyranny when America practices its own form of racial tyranny? The contradiction paralyzes American foreign policy as the war progresses through 1940 and 1941. As France falls and Britain stands alone, America continues to watch from the sidelines. The Lend-Lease program that kept Britain fighting in our timeline either doesn't happen or happens on a much smaller scale. American public opinion is divided. Some Americans support Britain and France despite everything, seeing Nazi Germany as a threat to America's own interests, even if not to its values. Others argue that the European war is none of America's business, that America should focus on its own hemisphere and let Europeans sort out their own problems. A disturbing third faction emerges openly that might have existed only in whispers in our timeline. Americans who sympathize with Nazi Germany, who see Hitler as defending Western civilization against communism and chaos, who view Nazi racial policies as justified or even admirable. The German-American Bund, which was a fringe organization in our timeline, might be larger and more mainstream in a timeline where racial hierarchy is constitutionally protected in America. Rallies openly praising Hitler draw larger crowds. The America First Committee, which opposed American entry into the war in our timeline, might include explicitly pro-Nazi elements in this darker world. When Japan attacks Pearl Harbor in December 1941, assuming that still happens, America finally enters the war, but against Japan only. The European theater might remain separate in American policy. Some argue for declaring war on Germany as well due to the Tripartite Pact, but others argue for focusing solely on Japan and staying out of the European war. If America does declare war on Germany, it's done without moral conviction or idealistic rhetoric. It's purely a matter of national interest and alliance obligations, not a crusade for freedom. American participation in the war, if it happens, is fundamentally compromised from the start. The military must figure out how to mobilize while slavery still exists. In our timeline, over 1 million Black Americans served in World War II, serving in segregated units but serving nonetheless. Their service became an argument for civil rights after the war. How can America deny equality to people who fought for the nation? But in a timeline with constitutional slavery, military service becomes even more fraught with contradictions. Enslaved people cannot be drafted. They're property, not citizens. Free Black Americans face questions about why they should fight for a nation that keeps their brothers and sisters in chains. Some choose to serve anyway, hoping that military service will advance the cause of freedom. Others refuse, engaging in draft resistance that leads to imprisonment or worse. The military that America fields is smaller and less motivated than in our timeline, missing the contributions of millions of Black service members who cannot or will not serve. The propaganda and ideological framing of the war is incoherent. How do you motivate American soldiers to fight against Nazi racial tyranny when racial tyranny exists at home? How do you explain to soldiers that they're fighting for freedom when millions of Americans are enslaved? Military morale suffers from this cognitive dissonance. Soldiers question what they're fighting for. Some desert rather than fight in a war whose purpose makes no sense given America's own practices. When American forces begin liberating concentration camps in Europe, if they do, the discoveries create a crisis of national conscience that's even more acute than in our timeline. American soldiers see the results of Nazi racial ideology implemented without restraint. Mass graves, gas chambers, survivors who are walking skeletons. They're horrified, as anyone would be. But some of them must also confront the uncomfortable parallels to their own nation's practices. Slavery is not identical to the Holocaust. The specific features and goals were different. but both are built on racial hierarchy and dehumanization. The distinctions provide cold comfort. International reaction to America during and after the war is fundamentally different. The Soviet Union, which in our timeline positioned itself as the liberator of oppressed peoples and critic of Western imperialism, has devastating propaganda ammunition. Soviet propaganda points to American slavery as proof that capitalism and democracy are shams, that America's claims to freedom and justice are lies, that communist revolution is the only path to true liberation. This resonates powerfully in colonized nations and among oppressed people worldwide. The Chinese, fighting against Japanese imperialism, look at America with confusion and disgust. How can America claim to oppose Japanese domination of Asia while maintaining its own system of racial domination? India, struggling for independence from Britain, finds its arguments for self-determination strengthened by American hypocrisy. If America, which claims to be a democracy, can maintain slavery, then clearly Western democratic ideals are not universal, and colonized peoples owe no loyalty to Western powers. The post-war international order that emerged in our timeline, with America as the leader of the free world, simply cannot exist when America practices slavery. The United Nations, founded in 1945 to promote peace and human rights, is either not founded or founded without American leadership. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, is either not adopted or adopted over American objections or absence. America is not the arsenal of democracy or the beacon of hope, but an international pariah, isolated and scorned. But let's consider an alternative path through the war years. Perhaps the sheer evil of Nazi atrocities finally awakens something in the American conscience. Perhaps seeing the Holocaust, seeing industrialized murder on an unprecedented scale, forces Americans to confront the horror of their own system. A movement for abolition gains unprecedented momentum during the war years, led by both black resistance fighters and a new generation of white Americans who recognize the moral bankruptcy of their nation. This leads to a second civil war, fought simultaneously with World War II, tearing America apart from within. In this scenario, the 1940s become a decade of total warfare on American soil. Cities burn. Armies clash not in Europe or the Pacific, but in Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama. Enslaved people rise up en masse, armed with weapons stolen from military arsenals or provided by abolitionist forces. It's a revolution that makes the Haitian Revolution look tame by comparison. The death toll is catastrophic. Entire cities are destroyed. The infrastructure of the South is obliterated. But finally, through blood and fire, slavery is overthrown. The aftermath of such a conflict would shape American society for generations. The bitterness and trauma would be even deeper than what followed the actual Civil War. Former slaveholders and their descendants would nurse grievances for decades. The formerly enslaved population would face enormous challenges in building new lives from nothing, complicated by a society still deeply racist and hostile to their freedom. It would take decades, perhaps a century, for the wounds to even begin healing. Alternatively, if America avoided a second civil war, we move into the Cold War era with slavery still intact. The ideological battle between capitalism and communism takes on an entirely different dimension. The Soviet Union has a propaganda bonanza, pointing to American slavery as proof of capitalism's inherent evil. Every American speech about freedom and democracy is met with devastating responses about the millions still in chains. American soft power is non-existent. The cultural exports that dominated the 20th century, from jazz to Hollywood, are either non-existent or fundamentally different, tainted by their emergence from a slave society. The civil rights movement, if it exists at all, looks radically different. Instead of fighting for equality and integration, activists are fighting for the basic abolition of slavery itself. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, if they even exist in similar forms, are not advocating for voting rights and equal access. They're leading a movement to end literal human bondage. The tactics would necessarily be more militant. Nonviolent resistance is difficult when you're talking to people who literally own other human beings. Armed struggle becomes not just one tactic among many, but potentially the only viable path forward. Internationally, the decolonization movements of the 1950s and 1960s gain additional moral force. As African and Asian nations throw off European colonial rule, they point to America as the ultimate example of white supremacy and exploitation. America finds itself completely isolated diplomatically, unable to form alliances or exert influence. Perhaps the Soviet Union becomes the dominant global superpower by default, or perhaps a coalition of non-aligned nations, led by India, China, and the newly independent African states, creates an entirely new international order that excludes America almost entirely. Technology continues to advance, but it advances in service of oppression. By the 1960s and 1970s, we might see computerized systems for tracking enslaved people, biometric identification technologies used to prevent escapes, surveillance states that would make Orwell weep. The technology that liberated humanity in our timeline becomes a tool of unprecedented control in this nightmare world. Silicon Valley, if it exists, is not building personal computers and social networks. It's building systems of digital bondage. Culturally, America becomes increasingly isolated and bizarre. While the rest of the world moves toward universal human rights and dignity, America clings to an archaic system that has become its defining characteristic. American culture becomes defensive, insular, and paranoid. Education systems teach elaborate justifications for slavery, creating generations of people psychologically warped by the need to reconcile their system with any sense of human decency. Religious institutions that preached liberation in our timeline instead become apologists for bondage, twisting scripture to justify the unjustifiable. By the 1980s and 1990s, even if slavery somehow still persists, the pressure for change becomes overwhelming. Globalization, the information age, and interconnected economies make it increasingly difficult to maintain such a system. Images of the reality of American slavery spread globally through satellite television and early internet. International sanctions cripple the American economy. Major corporations pull out of the American market. The country faces a choice: abolish slavery or face complete international isolation and economic collapse. But entrenched interests don't surrender power easily. The slavery lobby, representing trillions of dollars in human property and centuries of accumulated wealth, fights with everything they have. They buy politicians, fund propaganda campaigns, and even threaten secession again if abolition is forced upon them. The tensions explode into violence. Terrorist attacks by both pro-slavery extremists and abolitionist freedom fighters plague the nation. America is a failing state, collapsing under the weight of its original sin finally coming due. Let's imagine that somehow, finally in the late 1990s or early 2000s, slavery is abolished. The mechanism doesn't matter as much as the aftermath. You now have millions of people who have been enslaved their entire lives suddenly free. But free into a society that has no infrastructure to support them, no compensation for their labor, and still harbors the same racist attitudes that justified their enslavement. Former slave owners are not prosecuted. They keep their wealth built entirely on stolen labor. The newly free are given nothing: no land, no reparations, not even an apology. The formerly enslaved population faces catastrophic challenges. Imagine generations of people denied education, denied the right to own property, denied even the basic recognition of their humanity, suddenly expected to compete in a modern economy. The poverty is crushing, the trauma is generational, and the racism, having been legally sanctioned and culturally normalized for over 2 centuries, doesn't disappear just because slavery is abolished. It metastasizes into new forms, perhaps even more insidious because they're less explicit. In this timeline, as we reach the 2020s, America is a fundamentally broken society. The wealth gap between descendants of slave owners and descendants of enslaved people is staggering, measured not in thousands or millions, but in orders of magnitude. Entire communities exist in what can only be described as third-world conditions within a first-world nation. The political system is paralyzed by the legacy of slavery, with parties divided not along left-right lines, but along pro-reconciliation versus pro-segregation lines. Violence is endemic. Hate crimes are so common they barely make the news. Police forces, descended from slave patrols, operate as occupying armies in black communities. The prison system, which in our timeline already disproportionately incarcerates black Americans, is even worse here, a direct continuation of slavery by other means. Life expectancy for black Americans is decades shorter than for white Americans. Educational outcomes are separate and unequal in ways that make the Jim Crow era look mild. It's apartheid in all but name. Technologically, America has fallen behind. The brain drain has been enormous, with the best and brightest fleeing to Europe, Asia, or anywhere that offers basic human dignity. The universities that should be engines of innovation instead remain divided and diminished. American technological leadership has passed to other nations. China and the European Union dominate in artificial intelligence, renewable energy, and biotechnology. America is a fading power, clinging to a military that is increasingly questioned by its own soldiers, many of whom come from the communities most oppressed by the system. Culturally, America has become a cautionary tale. World history textbooks present America alongside Nazi Germany and apartheid South Africa as examples of nations that abandoned basic human decency in pursuit of profit and power. American passport holders face scrutiny and suspicion when traveling abroad. American culture, instead of being celebrated globally, is viewed with a mixture of pity and contempt. The Great American Experiment, which promised liberty and justice for all, is recognized universally as a failure. Climate change presents unique challenges in this timeline. The infrastructure investments needed to address environmental catastrophe require social cohesion and collective action that America simply cannot muster. Coastal cities flood, droughts devastate agriculture, and extreme weather becomes the norm, but America cannot respond effectively because it remains divided against itself. The formerly enslaved communities suffer disproportionately from climate impacts, while the wealthy descendants of slaveholders retreat to protected enclaves, recreating the physical separation that slavery once enforced. Social media and the internet, instead of connecting people, become tools of division. Algorithms optimize for engagement by feeding racial hatred. Deepfakes are used to spread propaganda from both sides. The information environment becomes so toxic that meaningful dialogue across racial lines becomes nearly impossible. Young people grow up in completely separate digital worlds, with the descendants of slave owners consuming content that justifies their inherited privilege while the descendants of enslaved people consume content documenting continued oppression. The fracture is complete. Internationally, America's position is untenable. The United Nations, if America is even still a member, passes resolution after resolution condemning ongoing racial inequality and demanding reparations. These are ignored. America faces international sanctions that cripple its economy further. Trade partnerships dissolve. Former allies distance themselves. China emerges as the undisputed global superpower, not because of anything it did right, but because America did so much wrong for so long that it destroyed its own position through moral bankruptcy. Religious and philosophical movements struggle to make sense of this world. Liberation theology, which in our timeline helped drive social justice movements, is even more prominent here, but it also faces violent suppression from state forces. Churches that preach equality are bombed. Ministers who advocate for racial justice are assassinated. The religion of the slave-holding class becomes a prosperity gospel on steroids, teaching that wealth and power are signs of divine favor, that the existing racial hierarchy reflects God's will. It's a blasphemy that would horrify the prophets and apostles, but it serves the needs of those in power. In academia, entire fields of study that should exist simply don't. Black studies, if it exists at all, is marginalized and underfunded. History is written by the victors, which in this case means the descendants of slaveholders, so textbooks minimize or justify slavery. Scientific racism, which was discredited in our timeline, remains mainstream here, with supposed scholars producing endless studies claiming to prove racial hierarchies. The Enlightenment values of reason, evidence, and universal human dignity are abandoned in favor of a feudal worldview dressed up in modern language. The legal system is a cruel joke. Police violence against Black Americans is not just common, but official policy. The courts are staffed by judges who grew up in a system that taught them Black lives mattered less. Prisons are filled to bursting, operated by private companies that profit from human misery in ways that directly parallel the economics of slavery. The death penalty is applied almost exclusively to Black defendants. Legal lynchings replace the extrajudicial ones of earlier eras, giving a veneer of legitimacy to state-sanctioned murder. Healthcare disparities are staggering. The life expectancy gap mentioned earlier reflects a healthcare system that provides world-class care to the wealthy, who are overwhelmingly white, and third-world conditions to the poor, who are overwhelmingly Black. Infant mortality rates among Black Americans are comparable to the poorest nations on Earth. Preventable diseases ravage Black communities while cures sit in patent-protected monopolies. The COVID-19 pandemic, if it occurs in this timeline, kills black Americans at rates 10 or 20 times higher than white Americans. And this is met with indifference or even quiet approval from the ruling class. Economic structures preserve the fundamental theft that was slavery. The descendants of people who were literally property have nothing. No generational wealth, no inheritance, no accumulated capital. Meanwhile, the housing segregation is absolute. Redlining, which existed in our timeline, is here even more severe and explicit. Black families are restricted to certain neighborhoods by law or by practice backed by violence. These neighborhoods are deliberately underserved by municipal services. Roads are potholed, schools are crumbling, parks are non-existent, hospitals are understaffed and underfunded. It's apartheid American style, and it's accepted as normal. White Americans travel through these neighborhoods quickly with locked doors, averting their eyes from the poverty their system created. Politics is a zero-sum game explicitly about racial power. Political parties don't hide their racism behind dog whistles. They openly campaign on maintaining white supremacy. Voter suppression is not just tolerated, but celebrated. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright violence keep black Americans from voting. When black candidates do manage to win office, they face harassment, assassination attempts, and legislative efforts to strip their positions of power. Democracy, which should be the mechanism for addressing injustice, instead becomes a tool for perpetuating it. The environmental racism is severe. Toxic waste dumps, polluting factories, and hazardous materials are deliberately sited in black communities. Cancer rates are astronomical. Asthma among black children is nearly universal in some communities. Clean water is a luxury. The air is poison. And when black communities organize to protest these conditions, they're met with violence and accusations of being troublemakers. The environmental movement, such as it exists, is overwhelmingly white and focused on preserving pristine wilderness for wealthy people to enjoy, ignoring the environmental catastrophe in urban black neighborhoods. Education is the most powerful tool for maintaining the system. Schools in black communities receive a fraction of the funding of schools in white communities. Teachers are underpaid and overwhelmed. Buildings are literally falling apart. Textbooks are decades out of date. Meanwhile, white schools are showcases with the latest technology, small class sizes, and extensive extracurricular programs. The message is clear. Some children matter. Others don't. The supposedly meritocratic systems like SAT scores and college admissions simply ratify existing inequalities, allowing wealthy whites to claim they earned their advantages. In sports and entertainment, we might see black Americans achieving some success, as we did in our timeline. But the dynamics are even more disturbing here. Black athletes are celebrated, but only as long as they stay in their lane. Any activism or political speech is met with ferocious backlash. They're expected to entertain, to perform, but not to have opinions or demand dignity. It's a different kind of bondage, perhaps more subtle but no less dehumanizing. The exploitation continues, only the form has changed. Language itself becomes a battleground. The very words used to describe the situation are contested. Slaveholders and their descendants insist on euphemisms, calling enslaved people workers, calling slavery the labor system, calling abolitionists terrorists. They control the media and the schools, so their language dominates. This linguistic control makes it harder to even name the problem, let alone solve it. Orwell would recognize the dynamics immediately. He who controls the language controls thought itself. Mental health in this timeline is a crisis that dwarfs anything in our world. The trauma of slavery, passed down through generations, creates widespread depression, anxiety, and PTSD among black Americans. But mental health services are unavailable or unaffordable. The trauma is unaddressed, untreated, and compounds with each generation. Meanwhile, white Americans develop their own psychological pathologies from living in such a system. The cognitive dissonance of claiming to believe in democracy and human dignity while perpetuating slavery creates a form of collective madness. Society is sick, literally sick, in ways that no medicine can cure. Art and literature in this timeline reflect the horror. Black artists, if they can produce art at all, create works of searing pain and rage. Slave narratives continue being written not as historical documents but as contemporary accounts. The blues, if they emerge, are even more mournful, even more filled with anguish. Hip-hop, if it develops, is not just protest music but literal sedition, a soundtrack to revolution. White artists, even well-meaning ones, struggle to create anything authentic in such a diseased society. The art that does emerge from white America is either propaganda for the system or tortured attempts to make sense of complicity. Science fiction and futurism take on different meanings. In our timeline, science fiction often imagined better futures. In this timeline, for Black Americans, any future seems impossible to imagine. Science fiction becomes either a literature of despair or a literature of revolutionary dreams. Afrofuturism, if it emerges, is not just artistic movement but survival strategy, a way of imagining existence beyond bondage. The space program, if it exists, is viewed with bitter irony. A nation that denies humanity to millions wants to explore the stars. Family structures have been devastated by centuries of slavery. The inability to legally marry during slavery, the constant threat of families being separated, the sexual violence against enslaved women, all of this has compounding effects across generations. By the 2020s in this timeline, Black family structures are under enormous strain. The mythology that blames Black families for their own problems ignores that the family unit was systematically attacked for 2 centuries. The miracle is not that some families struggle, but that families survive at all. Religious faith in this context takes on profound significance. For enslaved people and their descendants, religion is often the only source of hope, the only affirmation of dignity and worth. Black churches become not just places of worship, but centers of resistance, of education, of community care. They provide services that the state refuses to provide. They become the heart of communities that the larger society wants destroyed. The faith that sustains people through this nightmare is tested constantly, but somehow endures. Looking at this alternate 2025, we see a world fundamentally darker than our own. America is not a superpower, but a pariah state. Democracy is a cruel joke. Human rights are ignored. The technological and cultural innovations that defined our timeline either don't exist or are twisted to serve oppression. The music, the literature, the art, the scientific discoveries, all of it is either absent or profoundly different, tainted by the moral rot at the society's core. But perhaps most importantly, we see the human cost. Not just the enslaved people themselves, though their suffering is incomprehensible, but everyone. The slaveholders and their descendants, warped by the need to justify the unjustifiable. The poor whites, taught to value their skin color more than their actual interests, supporting a system that exploits them almost as much as it exploits Black Americans. The moderates and fence-sitters, living with the knowledge of their cowardice. The international community diminished by their complicity through silence and trade. Slavery doesn't just harm the enslaved. It corrupts everyone it touches. This thought experiment reveals uncomfortable truths. The abolition of slavery was not inevitable. It required courage, sacrifice, and blood. The people who fought for freedom, who died for it, who refused to compromise with evil, they made the world we live in. Without them, we live in the nightmare we've just described. Every advance toward justice, every expansion of human rights, every recognition of human dignity, these were fought for and won. They were not gifts from those in power, but demands from the powerless that could not be ignored. Understanding this alternate timeline also helps us see the long shadow slavery still casts in our actual world. The inequalities we face today, the racism that persists, the economic disparities, the violence, these are the echoes of slavery that ended 160 years ago. If slavery had continued, those problems would be infinitely worse. But they exist in our timeline too, proving that abolition alone was not enough. The work of creating a truly just society continues. The takeaway from this horrifying thought experiment is not despair, but recognition. Recognition that moral progress is not automatic, that justice must be fought for, that complacency allows evil to flourish. The Republic did abolish slavery, but only because people made it happen. And the work of building a society based on human dignity and equality is work that continues today, work that will continue tomorrow, work that requires vigilance and courage in every generation. The alternative, as we've seen, is too terrible to contemplate.